Documentaries are often differentiated from feature films as representations of reality. In a documentary, the plot is not pre-constructed, the dialogues are not created, and the ending or the flow of the narrative is not predetermined. The classical definition of documentaries was framed by the World Union of Documentaries in 1947, when they declared, by the documentary film is meant all methods of recording on celluloid any aspect of reality interpreted either by factual shooting or by sincere and justifiable reconstruction, so as to appeal either to reason or emotion, for the purpose of stimulating the desire and for the widening of human knowledge and understanding, and of truthfully posing problems and their solutions in the spheres of economics, culture, and human relations. This position was further reinforced by John Grierson in his essay. What does he say there? In his essay, First Principles of Documentary, Grierson put forward 3 principles. We believe that the cinema's capacity for getting around, for observing and selecting from life, can be exploited to a new and vital form. What is this form? This form is a documentary. We believe that the original or native actor and the original or native scene are better guides to a screen interpretation of the modern world. They give it a power of interpretation over more complex and astonishing happenings in the real world than the studio mind can conjure up or the studio technician recreate. And the third point, he says, is we believe that the materials and the stories thus taken from the raw can be finer or more real in the philosophical sense than the acted article. Grierson not only believed that documentaries are important, but he believed that documentaries are a tool for social change. He probably this zeal for using documentaries as a social change came from his educational background, because he studied in Columbia University the power or the psychology of the propaganda. So he believed that using documentaries as a propaganda is important for the state, and that he also believed that such a need is a benevolent need, and to educate the public, because in a democracy, Grierson very strongly felt that unless the public is educated, then they cannot bring about real change and the democracy fails. Now, this position of using documentaries as a propaganda, however, was there right from the time of the First World War or even earlier. So the position of the documentary as a propagandist has its inception in the early colonial newsreels, which showcase, as it is said by K.P. Jayashankar and Anjali Monteiro in their book A Fly in the Curry, that how did the Indian documentary emerge? Before the Indian documentary emerged as the Indian documentary, it was the British who were using documentaries to control the Indian minds and to ensure that our minds did not become too nationalistic, that it remained subjugated to the British rule. Most of the documentaries that were being made at that time were not made in India, or even the ones that were made in India were not necessarily made by Indians. It was the British, and they followed the Grierson school, and several of them were produced by Grierson himself, which believed in propaganding the good governance of the Queen, and that the British rule was best for India, probably. But it was during the Second World War that this propaganda approach of the documentary got a fresh impetus. And a lot of documentaries started getting made on the good governance and about the good things that were happening under British rule in India. The documentary film of the 1930s held a certain position. They were there to exist for a certain reason. And this reason was taken up by many people, not just Grierson. What was this position? That were the ideas of intellectuals, potentially social critics, coincided with the interests of some state. So it was not as if one was colluding with the state, but it was a belief that the state was a benevolent entity and that it did not need to be questioned or critiqued, but only the agenda of the state had to be furthered. And therefore, documentary films was a tool in that direction. And we have many films as part of this kind of a thought process. And most of the films mainly were made by Grierson and his school of filmmaking. And in India, why did the Indian filmmakers and films division start making films the Grierson way? Is because at that time, Grierson films were made freely available in India. Not only Grierson's films, but British films, more than Hollywood, were being made available in India because of the British rule in India. And a lot of filmmakers started imbibing Grierson, started making films like Grierson. Grierson films were technically very, very strong. However, they had an agenda. The films had to have an agenda. The films had to have a reason to be made. And the reason was not necessarily an artistic or a creative reason, but it was more pedagogic in nature. The reason had to be something to do with the benevolent idea of the state, of propagating to the people of the country that the state is there to help you, and therefore you should help the state. So, when Films Division started, it was the extended arm of the Information and Broadcasting Ministry of India. Films Division started in Bombay, and where it continues to be there. And Films Division continued to make a certain kind of films. Some of the noted films of Films Division, apart from the ones made by Manikal or even Sukhdev, were the films that were on tourism, that were on the states of India, the different cultures of India, and so on and so forth. K.L. Khandpur, in his essay Compulsory Screening of the Documentaries in India from 70 Years of Indian Cinema, says that realizing the importance of films as a medium of information, education, and for the recording of history, the government decided in 1947 to establish the Films Division. Its primary objective was to mobilize the dynamic medium of films to disseminate information to the broadest spectrum of Indian audience and to focus attention on important aspects of the country's life and development and seek their enlightened participation in the affairs of the nation. It was also entrusted with the task of projecting an objective image of India in foreign countries. An important event in the history of Films Division and the history and development of documentary cinema in India took place in 1967. The Committee for the Selection Films for National Awards, headed by Justice G.D. Khosla, refused to consider the film After the Eclipse by Sukhdev for an award. According to this committee, the film did not qualify for consideration as it could not be called a documentary film. As a consequence, a committee was set up by the Government of India to define the term documentary film for purposes of national awards, film advisory board, etc. The committee spent a considerable amount of time and effort and gave a brief report adopting the definitions which had earlier been drafted by the World Union of Documentary in 1947. Amongst the things that were discussed and the resolution that was arrived at by this committee, the resolution said, films based purely on fiction or fictionalized reality or those meant purely for entertainment should, however, be excluded from the definition of the term documentary. Similarly, purely advertising films, strictly instructional, training and teaching films and newsreels should also be excluded from the category of documentary films. This report was signed by M.D. Bhatt, who was the chairman, J.L. Bhavnagari, Jagat Murari, B.D. Garga, K.L. Khandpur, who was the convener, on July 5th, 1967. Now, with the coming of independence, when the Films Division was finally formed, it is very interesting to note that the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting of Independent India continued to use documentary as a tool for propaganda, for state-sponsored propaganda, to speak on behalf of the state and to speak for the state. It is very interesting that John Grierson, who himself was in favor of using documentary and felt the need for using documentary as propaganda, was himself very unhappy with the shape that the Films Division documentaries were taking. Again, as Anjali Monteiro and K.P. Jayashankar's book A Fly in the Curry quotes John Grierson, it says, "There is not enough creative urge. They do not reflect the spirit of the country lyrically and dramatically. I am tired of films on Indian music and carvings. I think cultural India had better be forgotten. Mrs. Gandhi talked of India on the march going forward in terms of social revolution. The Films Division should be more reflective of the overwhelming story of India, its new economic and social programs, the new life for the people." So, as we can see, that Films Division continued to make films that were non-controversial, that were pro-state, that spoke about stories that wouldn't really rock the boat, like the dances of India, the music of India, the snakes of India, and so on and so forth. The real issues, the issues that were happening on the ground, would come to fore much later. However, it would be wrong to say that nothing at all was happening in Films Division, that no filmmaker at all was making any attempt to change things. Some names which are very important in this context. One is Sukhdev. Sukhdev, when he made his documentary, Beyond the Eclipse, it was such an experimentation in form that there was a big debate whether it was a fiction or a non-fiction. And in fact, that is when the definition for documentary was formed. And they tried to clear up what was a documentary and what was not. So that can be said to be the first experimentation with the form of the documentary. After Beyond the Eclipse, there were other filmmakers who were also creating ripples within Films Division, making documentaries for Films Division, and yet breaking all the rules. If you remember, the earlier films of Films Division always were driven by the voiceover, and that one voiceover would be considered to be the voice of God, somebody who was as if speaking from above and telling you exactly what needs to be done, leaving no room for the viewer to reflect or to question. It was only a monolithic one point of view, one-dimensional in nature. The first time when we find that this starts changing within Films Division is with Sukhdev and with Manikal. Manikal made a number of films for Films Division which completely broke or ruptured this notion of what a documentary should be. The most talked about films of Manikal that were sponsored by Films Division, one is of course Dhrupad and the other one is Siddheshwari. In Siddheshwari, Manikal completely changed what he felt should be a biopic. Even though Siddheshwari is the biography of Siddheshwari Devi, the noted musician from Benares, and yet the film contains no voiceover, and the images speak for the film. And in the style of Manikal, it is a non-linear narrative, where, as Godard said, that there is a beginning, there's a middle, and there is an end. However, with Manikal, there were other filmmakers, Kumar Shani and a few others, who were also trying to experiment within the frame of Films Division. However, these films were few and far between, and Films Division films continued to be a propagandist in nature, to be non-controversial in nature, to be pro-state, and to be voiceover driven. Now, documentaries are supposed to be representations of reality. As in the words of Grierson, it is a creative representation of reality. However, how real is that reality? Is it the real reality that Grierson talked about, that whatever is happening is real, that nothing is constructed, nothing is crafted? Can there be such a reality? Can we really have such a reality? Because when you place the camera, how you're placing the camera, what kind of questions you are asking, how much you are revealing, how much you are keeping out, is definitely not the entire reality. Therefore, reality, whenever we talk about filming reality, it may not be the entire reality, but only a partial reality. The closest that we have come to see reality in the early years is when Lumiere brothers shot their shots of the station, the train coming, or the factory workers coming out, which was unedited, entirely unedited, and it lied beyond the realm of fiction as well as documentary or reality. When the documentary started, as mentioned earlier, it was started with the purpose of an agenda, and a certain kind of people were making documentaries, and they were making documentaries about other kind of people. And we see many documentaries being made by upper caste, upper class, or even British people on the Indian indigenous tribes. And it's not necessarily true that everything about them was something that they would understand. So it was their notion of these tribes or these people that they were filming and they were depicting. So how real was that, or how colored was that? And how colored can documentary be? Is it true that documentaries can be truly real? That is something we need to look at. So today, the term documentary has come to range a much wider range of things. From the time when it started as a propaganda tool for the British to rule over the colonized states, India being one of them, to the time when Films Division was formed by the government of India to create propaganda work, to speak for the state, the film has come a long way today. Even today, Films Division makes films. They make propaganda films. But Films Division is also moving towards a shift of stand. Films Division is now going more and more into documentaries that are critical of the state, that are critical of the status quo. And films, even when they are shooting or making a film on the culture of India, on some aspect of the culture of India, it is not the same voiceover-driven, stoic documentary where the maker speaks down to the viewer, assuming that the viewer needs to be educated in the same way that Grierson, when he was making documentaries, felt that the viewer needs to be educated to be a citizen of this democracy.